I see. Okay, okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this Bruegel discussion this afternoon about COVID-19 and the geopolitics of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. We have put together this afternoon's panel for you because there has been so much interest recently in the activities, both of European countries, the European Union, but also China, Russia, Turkey, and others in the EU's broader neighborhood. The interest concerns geopolitics in general. What are the different actors after in their activities in these regions, but more particularly now in the conditions of COVID-19, the question of vaccine diplomacy and the motivation for the different partners in providing support, either in the form of assistance or commercial sales of vaccines to these countries. What kind of strategy does that represent? Is this part of vaccine diplomacy in which different powers are seeking leverage through the provision of vaccines to achieve other goals, economic goals, foreign policy goals? Is this humanitarian support? How should it be interpreted? To discuss these issues this afternoon, we have an extremely well-qualified panel. We have with us Pierre Mirel, who is a former director in the European Commission and what is now DG NEAR, responsible for relations with countries in the Balkans and further east. Pierre has recently written a paper about the Eastern Partnership, and I think some of the insights there will be useful for this afternoon. Catherine Wendt has had many roles in the European Commission over the years, and most recently as head of unit for Serbia in DG NEAR. Alexandra Tominic also worked in the Commission some time ago, but has been in Belgrade now for a number of years as director of the European Fund for the Balkans. So she brings a perspective which is both from the region and from Brussels, and I am sure will be able to cast light for us on many of these issues. And Justyna Suchudlik is head of the Asia Pacific program and China analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and a major expert on China's role, particularly in Eastern Europe. So I thought and then I'd like to mention that there is an opportunity for all participants to pose questions to our panelists. You can do that through the Slido app, and you put in #Balkans, and you come to the page for our event this afternoon. And if you will type in your question, I'll keep my eye on those questions and filter in some of your questions to the conversation as we go forward. So I'd like to begin by asking you, Catherine, if you could give us an overview of the European Union's strategy towards, in particular, the Balkans. There is a view that these countries were promised membership in the European Union almost 2 decades ago. And since then, to be sure, Croatia has become a member, and there are negotiations for membership underway with other countries in the region. Others have been declared candidates, negotiations are about to begin, and so on. But is membership something which is on the horizon? And the horizon having a characteristic of, as you get closer to it, it always seems to be further away. Can these countries reasonably look forward to membership? And how would you describe the kind of benefits that they derive from their relationship with the European Union?
Michael, thank you very much. I'm very happy to join you and the panel this afternoon. Now we often hear that the enlargement policy, the Western Balkans lacks credibility. And I think I would start by arguing that the current enlargement policy is already credible. It's based on a clear framework, and we have clearly defined parameters for the countries to move forward. It is true that negotiations have got bogged down in recent years, and the countries do feel that they're not moving forward fast enough. The member states on their side feel that the reforms have stalled in some cases. So hence the question, is the policy still credible? And of course, in the Commission, we always believe there is room for improvement. So we have, as many of you will know, proposed last year a revision to the enlargement methodology to try and address the causes of these challenges. And I just want to explain this a little bit because it really is an important development from our point of view. The methodology is primarily designed for Albania and North Macedonia, both of which we hope will start negotiations soon. But we do want to extend it where relevant to the already negotiating countries, to Serbia and Montenegro, both of whom have confirmed their acceptance of this revised methodology, which is very welcome. Now, our objective is to reinvigorate the accession process, to make it more credible, give it a stronger political steer, make it more dynamic and more predictable. Let me just look at those a little bit and unpack them. Firstly, credibility. This has to apply to both sides. So the Western Balkan leaders on their side must deliver more credibly on their commitment to implement the fundamental reforms required. At the same time, the credibility means that the EU needs to deliver on its commitment to a merit-based process. When the partner countries meet the objective criteria and the established conditions, the EU needs to be ready to move forward to the next stage of the process. On the stronger political steer, this is really about both sides showing more leadership, if I could put it like this, and living up to the commitments which they've already taken. So we want to create more new opportunities for high-level political and policy dialogue with the countries, between the enlargement countries and the EU member states, to provide a stronger political steering of the accession negotiations process and to give better guidance on key reforms. The third issue is dynamism, and this is, of course, really important, particularly seen from the region and also seen from the EU, from the Commission side. We very much want the process to move on more quickly, but of course, subject to the countries meeting the objective criteria. We believe this can be done by organising work on our negotiation chapters around what we are calling clusters. And these are like groups of chapters around broad themes, like good governance, internal market, economic competitiveness, connectivity. And the idea is that we would open these clusters as a whole, which allow member states and the country concerned, the negotiating country, to focus on the linked reforms and challenges at the same time. Finally, predictability. We need to be clearer on the EU side about what we expect from the candidate countries on specific reform priorities and alignment criteria, as well as expectations for the next steps in the process. And we also need to accompany this with clear and tangible incentives like accelerated integration opportunities and increased funding. So we think that with these elements, the revised methodology will strengthen the enlargement process. Michael, you asked if any of the countries can look forward to membership in the foreseeable future and what's holding them back. As we know, the countries in the region are at different stages on their European path. They face common challenges, and I think I can summarize them relatively simply in our language of the fundamentals, as we call them. So these are the rule of law, the functioning of democratic institutions, public administration, and the economy. And here really the candidate countries need to pursue the reforms in these areas more forcefully and with a clearer political commitment. The interesting thing, of course, is that these fundamental areas are often mutually dependent. I'm thinking about like the rule of law and the economy. Without a solid rule of law and judicial system, the economy struggles to grow. And they're mutually reinforcing when they are taken forward together. We need to look, of course, at what we can do very concretely to give the sense of inclusiveness to the countries when membership is still some distance away. I think I wanted to give an example. So of course we support the region in many ways, and we can perhaps come to some of those later. But economic recovery, I think, is at the top of the world agenda, the global agenda. And here at the EU, the Commission, I think we have a very interesting story to tell about the engagement that we have in the Western Balkans. Our objective here is to speed up the region's economic convergence with the EU, because it will help the countries prepare for becoming EU member states, quite simply. This is why we launched last year the Economic and Investment Plan for the Western Balkans. We identified the priorities of the plan together with the governments of the region, and we set aside 9 billion euros of funding to deliver on them. This is a mix of grants, guarantees, and preferential loans from international financing institutions. We really want to offer the best possible conditions for the major investments in the Western Balkans. So in parallel with this, we're also looking at how we can integrate the Western Balkans more and more closely in the EU single market before accession. Last autumn in Sofia, the 6 leaders of the Western Balkans agreed to create a common regional market. And this is interestingly based on EU rules and standards and covers the 4 freedoms. So freedom of goods, services, capital, and people. And it really is the most ambitious regional integration efforts to date in the Western Balkans. And we are, of course, supporting this process both politically and technically. Some of the concrete steps that we foresee, or that the region more importantly foresees under the common regional market, are things like removing work permits, free movement of people with identity cards, cutting bank fees for payments within the region, and removing unnecessary compliance certificates for goods that have already been checked. I wanted just to give this as one example of a very concrete area where the EU, where the Commission is working very closely with the Western Balkans to really further the integration process in view of their membership, hopefully in the very near future. Michael,
Thanks.
I would leave it there.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Very clear, very detailed. I would say a sort of transformational agenda on the one side for the reform of these countries economically, politically, but sticky because of the many problems that there are in the region, and at the same time a program to bring them closer to the EU. Now, Justina, when viewed from Beijing, I'm sure this region looks very different. How important is it to China? And what are China's goals when it looks to the Balkans and more generally to Eastern Europe? I mean, surely it doesn't have the same kind of transformational ambitions as the European Union, but what is it seeking through its increasing investments, its increasing economic involvement, and these instruments that it has mobilized, the Belt and Road Initiative, the 17+1 framework? What is China really looking for in Eastern Europe and the Balkans?
Thank you, Michael, for the question, and thank you very much for the invitation. Good afternoon to all of you. First of all, because you asked me about the Chinese goals in Central and Eastern European countries, and because you asked me about Chinese perception, let me say what China understands as CEE region, because it is a very broad idea. Since 2012, there is we have, CEE countries in China, the format which is right now 17+1. Before 2019, it was 16+1. Is a format of cooperation between Central European countries and China, but this region is very broad because it consists of Balkan states, V4 countries, Bulgaria, Romania, but also Western Balkans, recently also Greece. So to be honest, when I look at Chinese, let's say, policy towards CEE, because of this format, I look at this very, very broad region, that China to some extent created this kind of region. So the first remark at the very beginning, when we are talking about Chinese goals and China, how China perceives this region, I think that there is a kind of an evolution, because the story started in 2012 when China decided to reinvigorate relations with this region. And at that time, I think that the most important goal was economic. It was the moment of the global financial crisis. our region, if I can say that we are the same one of that both Poland, Western Balkan, we are in the same region. At the time, we coped quite well with the crisis. China, as everybody knows, is over dependent on export and mostly cooperated with Western part of Europe. So at the time, China tried to find some new, let's say, economic partners, and we were pretty, let's say, perspective, a cooperation with us. So the main goal at that time for China is promoting and enhancing national economic security, because to be honest, China tried to find new export markets and also places for investment, especially of its overcapacities in the construction, in the manufacturing, also exporting labor force to try to use us to stabilize situation at home, to avoid unemployment, shutting down the companies and so on. And also because of our geographical location, we are between Western Europe, which is very important economically for China. We are important when it comes to some logistics, some connectivity. Our infrastructure is underdeveloped. China has this capacity in construction, in manufacturing, in labor force. So try to use this kind of capacities in our region to invest in some ports when it comes to Belt and Road Initiative and this maritime, and also this let's say rail connection and so on. So it was I think the most important goal at the very beginning. But then since Xi Jinping, especially because the format was created under the previous Chinese leaders, to be honest, the sponsor at the time from the Chinese side was Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, and the format at that time was at the level of prime ministers. But since Xi Jinping's term and his announcement of Belt and Road Initiative, because Belt and Road Initiative is younger than 16+1, I think that we can see also Chinese political and normative goals when it comes to cooperation with us. We are perceived, when you look at what a Chinese narrative about CE region, we are seen as political friends because we are former socialist countries, that we, as generally speaking, our countries established diplomatic ties with China in 1949. And we know each other because we have this socialist history, socialist past. We are also perceived to some extent as less developed, because let's say those countries that are not member states of the EU, but also new members of the EU, let's say we are newcomers, so our development is worse than Western part of the EU. We are also perceived to some extent as countries with some anti-Western approach, and China's narrative is that we were colonized by Soviet Union. China was colonized by the Western countries in the 19th century, for example. So we know each other, we understand each other. We are less developed, and to some extent, sometimes China are calling us as developing countries. So this is the kind of, let's say, having new political friends that we are perceived as political friends. Of course, when it comes to the member states of the EU, within this 17 countries, also there was very important issues to keep the EU consensus on China at the low level, and of course to discourage EU-US cooperation on China. And the last general goal when it comes to China, especially under Xi Jinping's term, is normative goals, I think. It's not only to, let's say, convince us to accept Chinese political slogans like Belt and Road Initiative, connectivity, win-win, community of shared destiny for mankind, which is now #1 topic, a slogan, but also to, how to say, to convince us to adopt some Chinese standards in investments, that China offers a loan and credit-based investment, or some standards in transportation. So this is a kind of an overview, I think. And the main goal. You also asked me to some extent about the effectiveness. And to be frank, my short answer about the effectiveness is that China is ineffective. But of course, when you look at this economic, we can also look at this economic, political, and normative domains. And of course, when you look at economic issues, only, I think, from the Chinese perspective, the only success story is a trade, because trade deficit on our side is growing. So trade surplus of Chinese side is growing as well, which it's not very good for us. But when it comes to the investment, I do not think that it's a success story from the Chinese side. Of course, there are some discrepancies between Western Balkans, I mean, those countries that are not EU members and EU members. EU members are really cautious about credit and loans that China offers, maybe except Hungary. And we do not, generally speaking, we do not use Chinese credit line, that the clients that are offered for us. In the Western Balkan, maybe situation is a little bit different, but I think it's not also the success story. We have many, maybe not many, but several examples that there's a problem with the repayment of the loans. There are some kind of, let's say, mostly, in my understanding, some promises and offers but it's difficult to see some finished in projects or some really success stories or some big projects. When it comes to the political dimension, maybe it's a little bit better. But to be frank, after the last summit that was held in February this year, which was, to be honest, the failure, because it was resistance from the CE countries to attend and to adopt some documents. So, well, the success story is that the format exists, that there is a perception from the western part of the EU that China is a real player in CE region, that we are dependent on, even over-dependent on China, which is not true, but there is a kind of a perception. So in that sense, from the Chinese perspective, it is a kind of success story. But of course, some negative results that many countries, especially Balkans, but also Poland, Czech Republic, are becoming more cautious about China. As I said, the latest summit ended up with failure when it comes to China, I think, because lower level participants did not adopt the guidelines, which for years, every year, it was the main product of the summit. About the normative issues, I think the similar situation that we are trying as a CE countries not to adopt our documents, some slogans that we do not understand. This community of shared destiny is the best example, that China is trying to push us to adopt it, to put in some documents, but we are saying, no, we do not understand what it is, and we do not want to have this and to sign any document with this kind of slogans. But we are trying to add our elements important for our interest. There is a kind of a sentence about 3Cs initiative. There's about it's a partnership and so on. So this is the short overview about the goals and the effectiveness. So I stop here, and I hope that for the next round we can talk about this vaccine diplomacy, because it is a kind of a new chapter after the mass diplomacy in 2020. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll do that. But I think your comments and the comments of Catherine have been very useful to create a framework for looking at the vaccine diplomacy issue. And the two of you have both described strategies which in some ways are parallel. You both, in a sense, use the concept of a normative approach, albeit rather different. And you certainly give a picture of Chinese interests as predominantly economic, related to investment, surplus capacity, and so on, but also having a political dimension. And I take away from the two presentations as well that there's a credibility issue maybe in both cases, but we'll come back to that in a little while. Pierre, looked at from Moscow, how do the Balkans and Eastern Europe look? Is this a priority area for Russia? Is it an afterthought? Is it pursuing its own geopolitical goals? Or is it pursuing a kind of negative strategy mainly intended to frustrate the efforts of the EU, NATO, and the United States? How does this region overall look in geopolitical terms from Moscow?
Well, seeing from Brussels and maybe under the control of Alexandra, who's in Belgrade, I would say that I would have said, let's say 10 years ago, that Russia had a global interest in the Western Balkans, primarily, in my view, to avoid that some countries would join NATO. Kind of obsession, I think, in Moscow. They failed with North Macedonia. They failed with Montenegro. Albania, already part of NATO, but that's a different story. So what remains basically is Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And therefore the emphasis on Serbia and on Republika Srpska, part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So I think that's the main interest of Moscow, to make sure that these two countries would not join NATO. But there's another interest, which is more, in my view, economic, that's energy. Russia is the supplier of energy in the region, very well established in Serbia, but not only supplying, but refining and selling derivatives and etc. And so I think they look at the Balkans from the perspective of countries to become members of the EU one day, and therefore reinforcing their own Gazprom, presence in an enlarged EU. I think these are the main, but there is another, they're using, of course, a key element, political element, to be present and reinforce their presence. And I think that's the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, in supporting Serbia in the dialogue. And as a member of the United Nations Security Council, they have, of course, a strong position to help and support Serbia. So I think after a couple of years, their basically influence is now much more limited to Serbia and Republika Srpska. But nevertheless, I think, we always talk about soft power of the EU. I think they are also using their own soft power. If you include, culture, religion in soft power, which I think personally I do, then certainly they have an influence with that, which is, I think, very much cultivated since a couple of years, not just by the Serb Orthodox Church, but also by President Vučić, for instance. So it plays a role, and including by financing a great number of small think tanks, small media. I'm not sure their audience overall in a country like Serbia, but nevertheless there is this presence. But overall, I would say, using a statement of Joseph Borrell, I would say that probably we have for too long overestimated the influence of Russia in the Balkans and underestimated the role that China is playing. At least that's my take.
Thanks very much, Pierre. Alexandra, looked at from the perspective of Belgrade and maybe beyond in the region in general, we've had these sort of three broad strategies presented now, EU, China, Russia, and President Vučić in Serbia sometimes gives the impression that he wants to be sort of equidistant from all three. Would you say that this is a perspective shared by the people in Serbia and elsewhere? Have they grown weary of the EU enlargement process? And are they open to the siren calls, as it were, from Beijing and Moscow?
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, it seems that everybody has an interest and a strategy, even the government, but that nobody has really the interest of the citizens of this region in mind. So let me explain this a bit more in detail. What we see here is that it's mainly about quick wins, personal enrichment covered with corruption, and about remaining in power. Doesn't matter with what global partners. And the citizens, the perspective of citizens depends very much whom you would ask. There is, of course, a number of citizens that is active on the internet, that is watching independent media, but then there is a big number of citizens that relies on state media outlets, and of course their views are very much different than reality. This is something that even the EU has seen, because in the conclusions of the Zagreb summit you can find even a very
project language regarding communication and how partners' commitments and activities should be presented. So it's good to see that the EU is starting to pay attention on that. All public opinion polls, we have also done one by ourselves last year, showed that the EU is still having trust and that EU integration is still listed as the priority. In Serbia, it's losing ground, but I think it's rather temporarily, and it's still about 50%. Well, which means that another half is rather skeptical. So it all depends on how you look at the data. We heard now about credibility and predictability of the EU policies. I think that they are lost. Because when you look at North Macedonia and what the country has done and where it is, it's still blocked. I think that the EU has made a big mistake there. When we look at the new methodology, I think it was personally only a time-buying exercise because the old methodology was not working because of technicalities. It had a balance clause for chapter 23, which was never used. So the dimension that the new methodology is bringing, that it's even more political, looking at the different perspectives the EU member states actually have about enlargement, I think it will be less fruitful than the old methodology was. Has the new methodology unlocked something? Not really. Has it changed something on the ground? Not really. So unfortunately, but I'm really skeptical. We also heard about economic convergence. I think that's very important. There are some experts that are writing about that since many years. For example, Dusan Reljic from the SWP, he's arguing that some parts of the structural funds have to be open for the Western Balkans because the differences are just too big. We here have really poor countries with poverty levels above 25%, and that's only according to statistics. When you look at real terms, it's even the numbers are even bigger. So when I read about the economic and investment plan, and also previously about the short-term aid regarding the pandemic, that's really great news. It's a great first step. But 2 points here. First, it will not be enough. And second, it absolutely has to be found ways to make sure that that money will not be used to strengthen state capture and their structures already, because that would be really a good night and goodbye. There are other actors that are giving cheap money without any conditions, and we see the results. I mentioned state capture. I think that this is the biggest problem, and the EU is big in their values. So tolerance is one of those values, but I think that they have been too tolerant to state capture tendencies, and that we can see that the two negotiating countries, Serbia and Montenegro, last year have been downgraded, for example, by Freedom House, from semi-established democracy back to hybrid regimes. So the whole Western Balkans are now stuck into hybrid regimes, with trends rather worsening than getting better. So this is the perspective from here. Rule of law is crucial, but somehow in this try to make the enlargement process or the accession process a technical one, that failed. It remains a political one. Rule of law is crucial, and I was so happy to see the latest report by the European Parliament, especially when you speak about Serbia. I will just give one example. In that report, the first concrete signal of lacking rule of law was mentioned, and that was the 2016 demolition of one street in Belgrade for the back then flagship investment by the Emirates. That situation and what the structures involved in that demolition in downtown Belgrade did not find it in the final report, in the final country report of the Commission for Serbia in 2016. far as I am informed, it was inside, but it was taken out at a very late stage. The point is, in the public document, it was not mentioned. And that was like the beginning of a trajectory that is very dangerous for the relations, for the credibility, and above all, for this country.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alessandra. These are worrying developments, clearly. Well, there's an echo. Does everybody hear that echo? Or is
No.
it just me? No, okay, it's just at my end. Catherine, I wanted to come back to you now and to move on to the response to COVID-19, which has been the latest of a series of major challenges, if not crises, that we faced in Europe and now globally over the last few years. When this commission took office, it was declared to be a geopolitical commission. And faced with a crisis like this, it would seem to be an opportunity for the EU to demonstrate, so to speak, that it puts its money where its mouth is, and it faces a challenge in its own backyard, and it's going to respond appropriately. Now, in the EU itself, we've come through with the Reconstruction Fund, Next Generation EU, which some claim to be a sort of Monet moment, which takes the EU into new territory. And this extremely ambitious program, even if it's been a bit slow to roll out, of the centralized procurement of vaccines for the 27 member states and so on. Have we responded in providing support to the Balkan countries proportionately, in line with our perception of them as being very important to us geopolitically?
I think we have. I think it's a difficult moment for the EU, and it's been a difficult moment for the Western Balkans. And I think at the beginning, in particular, obviously, we were all taken by surprise by the impact on health systems and on the economy. But I think that as soon as the EU started acting on its own side, we were also acting to support the Western Balkans in fighting the pandemic and helping its economic recovery. I mean, we were really in there from the beginning in reorienting assistance to the region. I mean, I can, like Alexandra, talk in particular about Serbia. Here we've given 66 million euros over the last 13 months, so a little bit more than the last year, for health purposes. So things, protective equipment, medical equipment, and ambulances. We also, and I'm back on the point I made before about the economic aspects, we've also made available significant amounts of money, again for Serbia, nearly 80 million euros to address socio-economic needs of the country. We did this for the whole region, of course, and we also reoriented existing funds to make them more reactive and respond to the needs that were immediately in front of us and in front of the region. And we always have the European Investment Bank, the EIB, where there are 1.7 billion euros of targeted loans to the region. It's not all about money. You've mentioned the other joint EU responses to the crisis. We have the Western Balkans are part of the EU joint procurement agreement. I think this is really central to the joint EU response. So they've been through this procuring medical equipment. They've also been receiving COVID-related guidance and assessment through the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. They've also, like the EU member states, been accessing the EU Solidarity Fund, which was extended to cover major health emergencies. And here we had Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania who've taken up the offer here, and they will get funds to support them in the costs that they've incurred in fighting the pandemic. Vaccines is difficult. Of course, I think I can be frank about that. But under these difficult conditions, we're doing all we can to deliver vaccines to the Balkans. We have made available 70 million euros for the region to cover the cost of vaccines purchased from member states. We've also, of course, been delivering. We've also been contributing as the EU to COVAX, which has been delivering vaccines to the region. So I think it's not been an easy time, but I think through the direct support to health needs, through the socio-economic needs, and the involvement of the region in the joint initiatives and joint response to the crisis, I think that the EU has delivered for the region in these last difficult months.
And for the EU, I think it's very important that they should be perceived as providing solidarity to these countries, given their very close relations with the European Union, and more generally worldwide. And as you say, through the COVAX scheme run by the World Health Organization, where the EU has recently doubled its contributions, it is contributing to still rather small quantities of vaccines to Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and countries around the world. But I recently checked the figures for the export of vaccines, whether on a commercial basis or as assistance. And as of the end of March, China had shipped 115 million doses worldwide, while at that point, the EU had exported 58 million. I think by now, both of those figures have increased significantly. But in public statements, President Xi and others have really tried to project the image of China acting as a good global citizen in this crisis and providing vaccines free to 53 countries around the world, as well as to China's own citizens and so on. Justina, is this a kind of cynical effort to leverage Chinese foreign policy goals by appearing as a good global citizen? Is it a commercial opportunity? Is it an occasion to best Europe and Western countries at their own soft power game? I mean, how has the COVID-19 challenge presented itself to China in the context of Eastern Europe and the Balkans?
Well, to be honest, I would like to start with explaining or try to explain the Chinese vaccine diplomacy and previously mask diplomacy. In my understanding, the most important goal why China decided to launch these two diplomacies, well, the most important goal is domestically driven, to be honest, because I think that vaccine diplomacy is right now the second chapter of the mask diplomacy. And mass diplomacy was launched because Chinese leadership was really afraid of stability, or maybe not stability, the support of Chinese society for the leadership because of the problems with the mishandling coronavirus problems at the very beginning in China. So it was, I think that this, let's say, diplomatic efforts was mostly for the domestic audience in China. And I think that right now the vaccine diplomacy is a kind of a second chapter of the mass diplomacy. Of course, what China is trying to say and to show, firstly, to its own society, to show that China is a provider of a public good, because vaccines are defined as a public good, that China knows how to manage, how to handle with the coronavirus, that right now everything is okay at home. So we have our own vaccines and we would like to donate or export outside. So this is the main important goal, domestic issues. Of course, when it comes to the, let's say, this diplomacy and focusing on other countries, and it is very important, especially when it comes to Central Europe and Western Balkans, China says, and you can look at the speeches given by Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, during the National People's Congress in March, that at the time I have this, I look at this speech, this press conference, and Wang Yi said that at that time, it was the beginning of March, China donated vaccines to the 69 developing countries. And the most important is that China would like to underscore that we are donating to the developing countries because there are problems with the deliveries of the, let's say, Western vaccines because of the problem. Because why? Because the European Union or European countries and the United States ordered more doses than they have people. So this is the problem for the developing countries, for the poorer countries with getting the vaccine. So this is the kind of a narrative from Chinese side. So we would like to provide a public good for developing countries, and we once again see countries are perceived as developing ones because China donated or exported to Hungary, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, and so on. So this is a kind of a important the message. And of course, when it comes to the diplomacy, it's to let's say confirm that China has political friends within the developing countries, I think. And I do not think that this commercial goal is very important. The most important are political ones, the domestic, the most important, and then to have this, let's say, have these friends among these less developed countries. And one interesting issue is that China is very, let's say, active in reporting about Chinese vaccine diplomacy. China does not use the vaccine diplomacy slogan because I think it's a bad overtone when it comes to the mass diplomacy, because in the Western part of world, Western world, if I may put it this way, it was perceived negatively. And it is, the coverage about the when the vaccines were delivered, that what about the vaccines the leaders of the countries are talking about, that the Chinese vaccines are priced in other countries, that Prime Minister Orban vaccinated by Chinese vaccine, that Serbia is very happy about having Chinese vaccines and so on. So this is the kind of a Chinese message. And of course, I have a problem with one remark in my last point. I have a problem, to be honest, about calling about China soft power, because it's mostly public diplomacy or even propaganda. And I also have some problems with Chinese soft power, especially in 2020, when we saw the Wolf Warrior diplomacy and really, let's say, a very negative approach, especially when it comes to the EU.
I think that's very interesting, the fact that part of the so-called vaccine diplomacy is really meant for domestic consumption, and the demonstration that China has influence with developing countries, with countries in Europe, and how that plays out in the domestic narrative of the government. That's a very interesting point. And I take your point as well, that those commentators who have said that China and Russia, Pierre, are sort of beating the EU at its own game, the soft power game. This is not really, as you say quite rightly, Justina, soft power in the sense in which Joseph Nye, who invented the term, the American political scientist, meant it, because he really meant by soft power the force of attraction of a model, the desire of countries to emulate a particular model. You know, he was thinking mainly of the American way of life. I mean, we might think more of the sort of economic, social, and political model in Europe. And I don't think that there are that many people in the Western Balkans or in the Eastern Partnership countries, Pierre, who really seek to emulate the Chinese model or the Russian model, or even that that's the intention of Beijing and Moscow. Your use of the term, Justina, public diplomacy, I think is perhaps more accurate as a backup for other policy goals. But Pierre, I think it looks rather different from Moscow than from Beijing. There's a lot of prestige involved. When we think even of the name that was chosen for the Russian vaccine, Sputnik 5, recalling the first man-made satellite that was launched by Russia. I remember that at the time of the first Sputnik, Mao Zedong made this remark that the east wind is prevailing over the west wind. And you sort of hear echoes of that a little bit in the comments of Russian leaders, I would say almost more than Chinese leaders, who wish to convey the idea that the Europeans are failing and that Russia is ready to step in where Europeans are failing. But how do you see, Pierre, this push to develop joint production schemes with EU member states, with Slovakia or with Italy, or possibly in the future with Germany even. Mrs. Merkel has commented favorably on the data concerning Sputnik 5, and the health minister in Germany has also talked this up. Mr. Söder in Bavaria, who recently was vying for the position of chancellor candidate, which for the time being anyway, he's put behind him. But from a Russian perspective, what is Russia after in all these schemes? Is this purely commercial? Is this a demonstration of Russian technical superiority? How should we interpret it?
Well, first of all, I would say, why not to have Russian production of Sputnik in our countries, providing, and that's why I don't understand that even Germany might, be interested, providing we have a full knowledge of what this vaccine is about, what it contains, the process, and etc. Because to my knowledge, this has not yet been given, for instance, to the European agency, or at least they have not come up yet with their conclusion. And it seems a bit like China, in a sense, with the mask, when they faced problems in 2020. It seems that Russians are not queuing for being vaccinated with Sputnik in Russia. So is it also a way to show, to the good citizens of Russia, look, people are asking for our vaccine outside, so why don't you want to use it inside? It may have to do with that, but I think it has to do with something else. Russia is in a desperate situation. Demography is dramatically going down. Economy is not brilliant. I mean, it's becoming kind of developing country, basically, exporting gas and oil and gas and weapons, okay? But I think Russia has missed high-tech development. Some would say the EU as well, okay? So so it may be also a way to show, look, no, we are still an important country. We have invented also this vaccine. Well, they have, but they don't have the production. They don't have the capacity to produce that vaccine. And therefore, asking other countries to create the production facilities out there. I'm not sure this is going to have a major impact. Maybe short term, there are indications because people are a bit starving for jobs these days, Slovakia and other countries. But will it have a medium to long-term impact? I'm not sure, frankly. And I think in a country like Serbia, unless I'm wrong, correct me, Alexandra, if I'm wrong, but I think that China has overtaken Russia in terms of vaccination, in terms of providing vaccines, and in terms of, let's say, importance of a good friend helping the country.
Thank you, Pierre. Alexandra, we have some questions from participants, which I think are directed mainly to you. There's one question: if Chinese investments and the provision of vaccines continue to flow into Serbia, the most developed economy in the region, will this not lead to trust in the EU falling flat? And what are the implications for regional cooperation? Is there some negative blowback from Chinese activism, from the president going to the airport or the prime minister to welcome the provision of supplies, first of personal protective equipment, now of vaccines? Is all of that having an influence in Serbia and beyond on how the EU is seen in Serbia and in the region more generally?
Thank you for the question. How many hours do we have to answer it? So
we have another 20 minutes.
So, well, let me start with, the propaganda movies we are watching of high officials welcoming Chinese first protective equipment last spring, and now the vaccines. Well, the tragedy is that, for example, some of those planes that came to Serbia a year ago, basically, was protective equipment. both the content as well as the transportation was paid by the EU. So that propaganda war or war for hearts and emotions was lost by the EU. So the EU paid the show for the others. So, and this is also where I would draw the line. So people do see very much. And when you look, for example, into opinion polls, like where would you like to see your children living? Nobody says China or Russia. So it's the EU. So people can make this distinction. Speaking about investments, even that is a story that's not selling any longer, because people start seeing the environmental impacts of Chinese investment. They start seeing black rain, red dust, the tremendous air pollution we are figuring in the whole country, but especially also here in Serbia. In the north, in Zrenjanin, a big tire factory is about to be constructed without the needed environmental assessments, without construction permits. They got subventions from the Serbian state of all three levels, like city, province, and republic. So whomever you address, they point you to go to the other level of more than 80 million euros. And they got, the Chinese investor got as a present 97 hectares of first-class land. So the tire factory is enormous. It's about to produce 40,000 tires a day by the end of the year, and it's placed 2 kilometers from a city and another 3 from a protected natural area. So people start seeing that, and they start seeing that due to very brave people on the ground, to activists, to people really fighting for their rights to breathe, basically, because when you draw the line, we are back at that. On the other hand, what we live here is not only like geopolitics becoming personal, it's rather state capture becoming personal, because for us here, it doesn't really matter if it's the Chinese making environmental damage or if it's the Austro-British Rio Tinto. It doesn't matter. Here is a state that puts other interests before environment, citizens' health, and so on. Talking about the vaccines, you just mentioned that you looked up the quantities. I also tried, before preparing for this panel, to look up the quantities of how many of which vaccines came to Serbia, and it's impossible to get that data. So it's not on any of the official homepages of the institutions, of ministries. It's just impossible. I didn't have the time to check press clippings and then to make my own calculation. So we have vaccines, but we don't know neither the financial cost nor the political cost. We don't know the package they came in with. We have vaccines, yes, but it's very easy to be generous in purchasing and also in giving it out when you're not held accountable by anybody for spending public money. What we see as a result is that the debt is increasing. We see also that there was a rebalance of the budget just in April. So the budget lasted for 4 months. And what I'm really a bit disappointed is the superficial media reporting, even of Western media outlets, about how great Serbia is handling the pandemic, just because there are now vaccines. First, the pandemic was handled terribly. Serbia was the first country in Europe to have a second wave already in summer, just after the elections, because before the elections, they lifted all restrictions and pretended that Serbia won against the virus. They have lied about the numbers. Investigative journalists have proven that. The fatalities of doctors is enormous. So there have been more than 110 doctors who died on their duties, compared to, for example, to numbers in Slovenia and Croatia. There, the statistics is single digit. So yes, again, we have vaccines, but the government also somehow missed to make a proper vaccination campaign. So now we have the situation that around 30% of the population is vaccinated, and then the interest is stopping. That's also a very clear indicator of the lost trust into institutions, into governments, even into doctors. That's also then the easy way to be generous to the region, because you don't have domestic demand, but you have, as I said, been generous in purchasing. Epidemiologically speaking, letting in thousands of people from the whole region, making crowds in Belgrade, I guess there would have been, epidemiologically speaking, better ways. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against regional cooperation and even less against regional solidarity. One is in both, not only in my job description, but also in my DNA. So it's not about that. We see this propaganda play also here at home. So you have vaccines, what do you want? To those being critical. And then to those who don't want to get vaccinated, we have the Swedish model, because our economy cannot afford to go into lockdown. So it's a very mixed situation where we have daily around or above 2,000 new infections, and constantly since months now around 20, 30, 40 casualties a day. And that's official data. And I just said that we already had the proof that official data can vary. So living the Chinese model, somebody said it now, like, is this something that people would like? Well, unfortunately, I have to tell you just one brief example, and that then I will finish my intervention. Belgrade is turning into a so-called smart city. There are face recognition cameras all over. Some great people gathered around the NGO Share Foundations have started a crowdsourcing campaign where they invited citizens to map the cameras that are being put in place. Why? Because from official the state parts, they could not get any information on the purpose of the cameras, what will happen to the data, how many are planned, where they are planned. So people are mapping them by themselves. For now, they have mapped 1,100 fixed cameras on around 450 locations across the city. Even the Commissioner for Data Protection has said that there is no legal ground for such kind of monitoring, but still cameras are being set up and we don't know the purpose, we don't know anything. One funny anecdote here, the technical specification was on the Huawei webpage, like Belgrade, the European Smart City, and so on. And again, people from the Share Foundation have then translated just what was written on the Huawei webpage and put it on their own webpage and accessible in Serbian for everybody. It took Huawei 10 hours to remove the content from their homepage. So although we don't want to live the Chinese model, we are getting the Chinese model, at least for now in Belgrade, with Big Brother is watching you without any information what's happening with our data.
Michael, a brief remark, if I may.
Yeah, Pierre, I'd just like to come back to Justina for a moment, because she asked me a little earlier whether she could pose a question to Alexandra, and then we'll come to you, Pierre. Justina.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question to Alexandra, because to be honest, I read an article right now, I don't remember where today, that China is, let's say, that is a kind of Chinese victory when it comes to the vaccine diplomacy, because there is many people get vaccinated in the countries where China exported or donated vaccines. And these articles, the authors of the article say that because the victory is because we do not, or the societies of these countries do not ask question about this effectiveness of these vaccines, because of course in the EU we have some vaccines that should be approved by the EMA. So I would like to ask if there is any discussion within Serbian society about the effectiveness of Chinese vaccines.
Absolutely, yes. And absolutely, we see the results. We had the first Chinese vaccines coming in January. So we have really vaccinated and fully vaccinated people now being here for weeks. What I see in my direct surrounding, so it's really just a very personal thing, because of course there is no official statistics about that, is that people that got it do get infected. And that it's not only easy health conditions after having been vaccinated with the Chinese vaccine. And as I said, it's not official statistics, it's just my personal surrounding. And it is absolutely being discussed. But as we don't have any evidence or data as we have with other Western vaccines, I mean, you don't have anybody to ask and you don't have anybody to turn to. What has been discussed here is that the third doses might become necessary even before. I mean, even others are also saying that the third doses soon will be necessary. but it was about, we in Serbia here got the Sinopharm vaccine, and that's been discussed because the Emirates had some clinical studies, and so that came from there. And another thing, like Reuters had last September, the headline that Serbia will be the country where the third stage clinical testing for Sinopharm will be made. And that was just mentioned there. And then we never heard about anything about that again. We don't know if it took place, if it didn't. The next thing we heard was just that the first tranche was 1 million, and then 500,000, and then I think another million. So really a lot of vaccines came to Serbia over the last 4 months now. But yeah, we don't have official data on that.
I think there's even been some recognition from Chinese experts that Sinopharm provides less immunity than some of the other vaccines widely developed, although the claim is that there are fewer hospitalizations and fewer deaths, even with Sinopharm. But
the problem here is that we don't know which mutations are circulating. We don't have the laboratory capacities to know which is now the current mutation form, and if the vaccines at all are protective against that. So what we lack in total is transparency and knowledge. So throughout the spectrum.
Thanks very much, Alexander. With my eye on the watch, I'd like to give you the floor, as it were, Pierre, and then come back to Catherine for a brief last round. Pierre.
Okay, a brief remark on this question. I think the Serbian government has really created an anti-EU narrative on the occasion of vaccine provided by China. We remember President Vučić talking about EU solidarity as a fairy tale, etc. I was really shocked when we know, and Catherine reminded us of what the EU has provided Serbia with in terms of support. Even more over the past 15 years, I think it goes to some 400 million euro in the whole healthcare sector on refurbishing hospitals and etc. So it's really shocking. And some people said, well, it's because the EU is not able to communicate well, etc. I don't agree. I think it's because the government is creating the narrative, and at the same time, he's controlling the media, or at least most of the media. So it's very difficult to be heard outside this narrative, outside the state media. But then I ask myself, why? What's the reason? I don't know, Alessandro.
The EU with the ending of the exemption for the Balkan countries from the EU vaccine export control program. What kind of message is that giving? And there's a broader question, given the challenges that these countries are facing, whether the EU should not be doing more to reach out to civil society, people-to-people contact, investments really in the population, in a situation in which the governments can't always be relied on, for example, through Erasmus Plus and by other programs. So don't feel obliged to answer those specific questions, but if you'd like to pick out one or two of them and maybe just give us your parting thoughts.
Thank you, Michael. That's a lot to deal with in about 2 minutes, and so I won't unfortunately be able to assess everything. There were two things I wanted to come back on. One was to help Alexandra in her figures, because in terms of the how many doses
from the audience. Social media, but what is really important, and that China, it is not a new idea, that China a few years ago said in Chinese think tankers and Chinese, but what is very important and it to do is to approach to the, let's say, young people, to influence the maybe the future elite of the country. And so the last point is that I'm not sure if talking about 17 plus, we mostly are talking about summits or theater, reading books, and so on, that are prepared for young people. So this is, I think, the very important dimension that we should look at very, very carefully.
Thank you, Justina. Pierre, with even China getting into civil society, people to people, these are concepts very much identified with the EU until now. Faced with these challenges against the background of COVID-19, in 60 seconds, what should the EU be doing to up it in the Balkans?
Article of a good friend, journalist living in Sarajevo. He wrote literally, for many people in the Western Balkans, enlargement is dead. Enlargement is dead, right? And I asked myself, well, you know, what happened? And I think what happened is probably that 20 years ago, we were too naive after Thessaloniki in basically using the same tools, Central European countries, but could not work with the Balkans because of their post-war situation. You know, we had to do with unfinished states, still unfinished, like Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, etc. So it could not work. I think we made a mistake. And I think now the emphasis should be on the economy. And even using the new accession methodology, I would concentrate on cluster 2. That is everything related to the internal market. Try to bring the countries as quickly as possible in the internal market, including participating in, you know, relevant Council of Ministers, etc. Plus, and that's a key issue, and I agree with my friend Dusan Relic on that, to provide the countries with some form of structural funds. It's completely artificial that Bulgaria, with the same size, same population as Serbia, is receiving 8 times more from structural funds than Serbia from the IPA program. So this is where we could make really the difference, and boosting investments and trade within parallel the regional common market that the countries are developing. And at a second stage, you know, the other accession chapters and etc., but concentrating on the economy in the first place.
Thank you, Pierre. And the last word is with you, Alexandra. At the beginning, you reminded us that in the opinion polls that you have organized in the Balkans, there's still a majority support for the European Union in the countries across the region, Serbia being a little bit of an outlier in that respect. What would you like to see the EU doing in response, in particular, to the latest economic and public health crisis in order to reaffirm its solidarity with citizens in the region?
I think Serbia is a special case because here the EU really managed to lose those people that were in favor of the EU, those that were modern, open-minded, and so on, because it supported the people in power now, what with all the consequences we see here. So people felt somehow betrayed by both. They were not in favor of the people in power. And I would just like to add, like somebody mentioned, the changed narrative or attitude towards the EU. I don't know if changed those settings, and I will leave it with that. Everybody can Google what I mean and who they are. The EU, we're talking about credibility and predictability, and I would like to take up the question on the conference on the future of Europe. It takes place without the Western Balkans, and it's not a conference on the future of the EU, it's a conference on the future of Europe, where the Western Balkans are part. And when you look at the headings there, the EU is a global actor. What do you want to discuss there without including the Western Balkans? It's your home ground. Health union. We have seen now in the pandemic that you cannot just leave a part or out of your continent. So you have to include the Western Balkans. And climate change and environment. In the Western Balkans, the biggest polluters of this continent are located. 16 thermal power plants are producing more emissions and dirt than all the 250 in the EU. So it's so artificial that the conference on the future of Europe is happening without the Western Balkans. So I think apart from the pure accession process, a lot can be done to actually show solidarity and real commitment. There are new actors in the region. There are new political actors and forces. They have to be recognized and they have to be supported. And of course, free media needs much more support than before. There have been successful examples in the 90s. Unfortunately, for some places, we are back there. So just look at the old documents and programs and check your drawers, and that's it. Like it's not rocket science, but we have made a full circle and we are back at the beginning. Unfortunately, just 20 years later.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. Before your very last remarks, you ended on a high point, and I would prefer to end that and the idea that in the framework of the Conference on the Future of Europe, not just on the future of the EU, we should build bridges with the countries of this region. I think that would be one of several messages to emerge from this session this afternoon. I'd like to thank very much Alexandra, Catherine, Pierre, Justina for your generosity with your time and for sharing your expertise with us. You certainly made me think a lot about these issues and to challenge some received beliefs. I'd like to thank our participants as well, to apologize to those for whom we did not get round to their questions, but many others I think will recognize that in the discussion, we touched on the themes that you raised. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Matilda and Katja at Bruegel who made this possible, and look forward to continuing the discussion on another occasion.